a little bit more complicated and complex, because that's how messy and complicated the world is out there. So it's natural when you run through this set of slides or this set of notes, you realize you take a lot of time. You stare at the diagram, you try to phantom the point to point. Right? So it's natural, but as a macroeconomic student, you must know them. Your macroeconomic study is not happily ISLM and stop. It goes beyond the ADAS. So here we want to focus on the oil prices. Something that you know is still happening in the world we live. Oil prices are still escalating, skyrocketing. Therefore, we want to see the possible effect. Okay, so with that, let's look at page 36. Okay, now, when you have, first of all, a supply shock, you already know, okay, firms must cut back output. So in this case, SRAS itself have to shift left. So you don't have enough resources, be it your oil, energy, or your minerals. Okay, so naturally you have to produce less, and that can only be reflected by AS curve shift left. Cannot be movement, because movement must be due to wages, etc. Right, but here it's purely at the same price level, you produce less. But coupled with the fact that if it is permanent, there was the loss of resources. So your YN must drop, your LRAS has to shift left. Alright, so these are your two possible, in fact, two outcomes from a supply shock. Firms in the short run has to cut back. With not enough energy, they have to slow down the production. Alright, factories in Japan cannot operate as long as they want. In fact, okay, in Japan itself, okay, they have to cut back the use of air conditioning. They can only use their aircon 6 hours a day and set it at 27 degrees, which is freaking hot. But they have to do that because they lost the nuclear field or nuclear plant. So this is what happens if you have a shock and it's permanent. Firms first have to adjust. Then we also know, because if it's a permanent shock, you lost the resources, SRAS will shift left. So in this case, generally you could see output will fall continuously and prices will increase continuously. Right? But now we want to add one more effect, that is interest rate. Remember Keynes effect says price goes up, interest rate must increase continuously so that we can see investment drops. So the objective of the diagram given in page 36 is to show you the devastating effect. So the most common question students ask me is, how come the curve must go to point C? Right? Remember, this is our objective. We don't want just to show short-run effect. We want to see the long-run devastating effect. That if it is only in the short run, output drop one time, price increase one time, interest rate increase one time. But that is not devastating enough. You want to illustrate how terrible it gets. You have a continuous shift of both curves. Okay, so I'll run through the analysis with you, go back and then you try drawing. So the diagram starts at point A, as usual, you should know by now, IS equals LM. You can put in there output Y1, bring it down. By now you should know ADAS, or should I say ISLM, point A, should give you a point on the AD curve. Then with your AS1, this is also your Y1. Go across P1. But because you assume Y1 is YN1, you know the labor market is at equilibrium, P1 is P1. So by now you should be familiar already. Alright, so this is the topic you cannot just read through. If you are very conscious to narrate to yourself, money market, goods market, labor market, you will get all these pointers that I told you. So you assume the economy is in long run first. Okay, so there was a negative shock. It could be a war that burned down the oil fields permanently. You lose it permanently. So in the short run, this is actually your step 2. Firms react first. Right? Firms found out that with lesser resources, they have to cut back their output. Okay? Right? And they have the opportunity to drive up prices. Okay? Right? People will actually, with the same demand, drive up prices of the goods. So that's why this is the short run. The AS curve shift up, output fall, because the firm has lesser resources, but the firms can increase prices. So that was the shift of SRAS. Okay, now we want to shift the LRAS. Okay, so take note now, step 3. There's a fall in the amount of resources. Okay, LRAS can shift left. Okay, it can actually shift to point B or below or on the left of B. If I shift my LRAS to point B, there's nothing to discuss already. So that's why I didn't. I deliberately shift it to the left of point B to illustrate the devastating effect. So a lot of times students ask me, okay, they can understand shift of AS A to B, but they don't understand why the LRAS must shift at the left side. The intention is to show you there is a continuous drop in output, rise in prices, and interest rate. So in the exam, if you drew LRAS shift to point B, you will not get the full marks. The economy just have a one-time increase in price, output fall, full stop. There's nothing else to say. But you deliberately shift the LRAS to the left, okay, to tell you that at point B, okay, I'll pull an arrow out to show you. Now if you compare Y3, you cannot compare to YN1. It's invalid. You don't have that amount of resources anymore. The amount of resources is lesser, so your potential output is now YN3. Now, this is a little bit puzzling to students. They go like, hey, isn't there a natural disaster? Didn't you wipe out resources? How come output can be more than YN3? It's the oil prices, so typically you may still have the same amount of workers. Right? So you actually utilize them and they give you an output more than resources that can be produced at maximum level, YN3. So with that, it tells you, okay, unemployment is higher than the natural rate. They are actually spelled out for you in page 37, but I'll put it here so that you can refer. And that's how we know, okay, at the same time, the prices, right, okay, P2, okay, compared to your PE is actually lesser. Because on your LRAS, there is a PE. If you can't understand PE less than PE3, intuitively here already tell you wages has to go up. Right? Okay, and that tells you the firms, okay, has to shift the, or should I say SRAS has to drop one more time. So this is the point that left the students very puzzled. They don't understand how come prices goes up, P2, but lesser than PE3, because they couldn't grasp where is PE3. Which I feel that in the exam, when you're under stress, you also cannot grasp it. But as long as you can see, if output exceeds potential, unemployment rate is low, drive up wages, AS curve must shift. So there was a continuous shift in AS to reach point C. This is what you want, to show the continuous drop in output and a continuous increase in price level. That is the intention of the analysis given in page 36. So hear me clearly. LRAS can shift to point B, or in fact it can shift to the right of point B. If you shift to the right of point B, there's nothing devastating. Your economy is still producing at lesser output and adjust backward. But we deliberately shift it to the left. So you can see a continuous drop in output, continuous increase in price level, and not only that, a continuous increase in price level. So this is actually based on Keynes effect. price increase, interest rate goes up. Right? And so much so that you can see investment keeps falling. So when you study the diagram in page 36, although it looks more complicated, but this is your objective. You want to show a permanent oil crisis. It's not one that firms cut back production, price goes up, but one that has ever rising interest rates, but investment drops. Right? Or else, the oil crisis is just like any shortage in resources. Right? But you want to put in the point of the devastating effect. The occurrence of oil crisis can come up mainly in section B, but be prepared, sometimes it does happen in section A. Okay, right? And if you put in a permanent crisis, then remember your step 3. Okay, you have to therefore shift the LRAS further to the left. Okay, so in this case, you turn to page 37, you can see this is what you want to emphasize. But, okay, those of you studying for section B, they wish to know, right? There's something that you realize in your diagram. Your AD is constant. Right? You keep shifting the AS, but we know AD can shift. So besides P and I, the negative shock can have an impact on AD via government spending. Right? Okay, and that in fact tells you if your G were to go up, your AD will go up, and price will even further increase. This is because when you have an oil crisis, right, we know that oil prices eventually will jack up energy prices. Okay, so countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, they give very substantial subsidy. Almost 40% of their fuel prices were subsidized. Right, so if the market rate is $1, they only pay 60 to 70 cents. So they were heavily subsidized. So that tells you in the short run, when oil prices continue to increase, this will balloon their budgets. Right, so government will run out of money. So in recent years, the Malaysian and Indonesian government wants to cut back the subsidy, but it drew massive protests on the street. Okay, so that will heighten the scenario of the negative impact on the oil prices. Okay, and secondly, right, government recognize that they must cut back the dependency on oil. So as high prices of oil continue to loom, government nowadays try to look for alternative sources. Right? So one is to look at reusable oil. Okay, or Singapore, we turn to natural gas. So as the oil prices actually looms, you start to also check out your R&D or your research fees or hunting for alternatives for oil, to replace oil. So you can use reusable oil. Okay, so there's a study that vegetable oil, that McDonald's or KFC use can turn into petrol by adding more chemicals, which is good. But of course, it is at a preliminary stage of experimenting. But you can depend lesser on the fresh crude oil. Or Singapore turns to natural gas. But if you use natural gas, you have to lay the pipes, you have to change our infrastructure. So all these are costly. Right? So here you can see the earlier diagram in page 36 merely emphasize what happens to the firms. They have to keep cutting back their production because of lack of resources and increase in wages. But at the same time, we know the AD actually can shift to the right, which will worsen the prices. Right? Okay, so this is actually quite an in-depth study on oil or energy prices in terms of economics. Okay, now, besides knowing that these are the possible outcomes, ever escalating prices, continuous drop in output, a fall in investment, a possible ballooning government's deficit. Okay, the next worrying sign is, as what you saw in page 38, that it may actually prolong. Okay, and this is example USA between year 2010 and 2011. Right, you remember in US in 2010 they are still hit by the financial meltdown, so high unemployment. But they are also facing high prices due to food and oil shortages. So that will put the economy into a phenomenon known as a stagflation. Okay, alright? So when you deal with a stagflation, it's very tricky because when you have a stagflation, you have actually two problems. Alright? So therefore you have inflation plus unemployment problem. Okay? Both problems they will all exist. So it is like having two hands with burning coal. So you must decide which one you want to solve. You have two problems. So let's look at here. Okay, so if you think inflation is going to be something you want to solve first. So therefore you want to reduce your AD, example, via contractionary monetary policy. So in other words, you drive up interest rate, you continue to worsen investment. And not only that, the fall in AD will result output to drop. And in this case, you further worsen unemployment. Right? So if inflation is just rocket high, you've got no choice really. You need to cool down the economy. You will use contractionary MT. You won't use fiscal policy. Because people already hated you for high inflation and you're going to cut spending, raise taxes, you will lose votes very fast. So government will tend to use contractionary monetary policy. But firms will be hurt. Alright, with continuous rise in interest rate. Okay, so what do? You transferred from one problem, you add it to the other problem. You didn't solve it, you only solve one problem. Okay, but now let's say if you want to, your policy aim is to reduce interest rate, to increase investment AD output. Okay, so your aim is to lower unemployment. So in this case, you can see you can use expansionary monetary policy so that you can cut interest rates. Okay, so this is actually good because you boost your investment, you get jobs for the workers. However, you can see, right, the increase in AD will further worsen inflation. So there's no way you can totally remove the problems. You solve one, but you add on to the other. So that's why a stagflation is a worrying sign. Alright, so at the crisis in 2010, before the liquidity trap is a threat to US, the first nightmare that they thought they would face was the stagflation. Because the moment it sets in, you have two hands with burning coal. You do not know which fire to put off. Okay, and in this case, you could see a lot of economists, they argue the best way, is to do nothing at all. Just let the economy take time to adjust. Alright, so in this case, the best macro policy is not to respond. Okay, but is this possible in the real world? Okay, in reality, this is impossible. Okay, as high inflation with high unemployment, you will actually lost political votes. So government will always be under pressure to do something. So remember, we always like to say politics is dirty. It's always dirty because you only want to win votes. But ideally, you should do nothing. Right? So if you do nothing, your high inflation and your unemployment will result you to lose your political votes. The rich will be very angry with you. Alright? They find that the purchasing power is eroded away. The poor are suffering. Right? They lost their job and they have to cope with inflation. So you will lose a lot of votes. So you can't be seen as doing nothing. Especially when election is near, you'll be under pressure to do something. You either raise interest rates or you lower interest rates. So that's why stagflation is something that if you don't manage well, it goes off tangent. Alright, so that's the discussion of a negative shock. Not only you want to reflect what happens to the economy, you also want to reflect the possible harms that the economy will experience and detrimental to the government. Okay, so always remember, government all over the world, or 99% of the countries in the world, needed votes to stay in office. So policies are driven sometimes not because of economic problems, but more on they want to secure their votes. So they do something that will please the people, depending on what they want, whether it's low inflation or low unemployment. So is it possible to do nothing? In reality, it's impossible. Okay, alright? So that is the negative shock. Now let's now look at positive shocks. I won't discuss too much. Okay, you go back and you analyze the diagram for yourself, but the positive shock simply means, okay, firms can increase output. Okay, so Y increase via SRAS shift rights. So the situation is favorable to the firms. Okay, then secondly, we know that the country's output, okay, increase because of more resources or there is increase in efficiency. So you will increase your YN and now your LRAS will also shift to the right. Okay, so this intuitively is quite simple. Okay, if there's a greater efficiency, resources are more available, the firms can readily increase output, AS curve, shift right. But the country as a whole, the potential output also increase. Okay, so that's why you can see there was a continuous drop in, you should see here, there's a continuous drop in SRAS, output increase, potential output increases. But at the same time, the benefit of it is interest rate keeps falling and you boost investment. So it's a total opposite of a negative supply shock. However, I want to highlight to you, this diagram is invalid. How come we cannot use this diagram? Because here, right, the diagram here reflects reduced price level. This is inflation. And if you recall, inflation should occur under recession. But the diagram shows output is always increasing. Investment is increasing. So a good answer should not use P and Y axis. Right? So therefore, you should change it to use pi and y axis, not P and Y. That is, pi drops, P increase, but slower. Alright, so you could see how technology has evolved and changed our life. Okay, cars are cheaper. You never say cars are cheap, they are cheaper. It means price increase but much slower. Okay, you see electronic goods are cheaper than 5-10 years ago. You never say electronic goods are cheap. You never say that. So things are cheaper means inflation rate drop. So instead of writing P and Y, you should use pi. Inflation rate drops with output increasing. Then that is valid. So this discussion here reflects the standard ATAS cannot be used as and when you like. They must make sense. Price drop, It's a very devastating state of the economy because it occurs when you have recession. Then it doesn't tell you the diagram. The diagram keeps showing output is increasing, investment going up. How can this be recession? You can't. So with that, it tells us we needed the revised ADAS model. Okay, so with that, let's move on to page 41. I leave it to you to read page 40 yourself.